There's a specific kind of silence that only exists between people who used to talk every day. Not the silence of a fight, because a fight at least means someone still cares enough to be angry. This is the other kind. The kind where the phone just stops ringing, and nobody ever quite tells you why. And you're left doing that thing where you check if your phone is actually working. Because surely, this is a technical problem and not a decision somebody made about you. I bring this up because I want you to hold that feeling in your head for the next 20 minutes. Because it is, right now, apparently, the entire emotional situation of a pillow salesman from Minnesota. And I promise you, by the end of this, you will understand exactly why that matters, far beyond one man and one primary. So, here's what happened, stripped of the noise. Mike Lindell, yes, the MyPillow guy, yes, the man who once told America that Chinese servers held the secret proof that the 2020 election was stolen, ran for governor of Minnesota. He ran with Donald Trump's full endorsement. Trump called him a patriot, praised his sacrifice, put his name behind him publicly. The whole ritual. And then the actual voters of Minnesota, the ones who show up and fill in the little oval, looked at the ballot and picked someone else. Not close either, double digits. And here's the part that should be a footnote but has somehow become the entire story. It has now been close to a week, and Mike Lindell still has not conceded. He hasn't called his opponent. He hasn't done the thing that losing candidates in a functioning democracy are supposed to do, which is admit out loud, in public, that they lost. And meanwhile, the man who endorsed him, campaigned for him, called him a patriot, has said nothing, not a word. No rigged election tweet, no rally, no defense. Just quiet. Now, of course, the easy version of this story is, look at this guy, still can't take the L. And sure, that's true, but that's the version that gets you a headline, not an understanding. What I actually want to get into with you today is two separate but connected questions, because I think they matter more than most people are giving them credit for. First, what does it actually cost a person to build their entire identity around a claim that turns out to be structurally, mathematically, provably false, and then have to do it again in real time, on camera, when it happens to them personally? And second, maybe more importantly, for where American politics is heading, what does Trump's silence here actually tell us about how loyalty works in that world, who it protects, and who gets quietly, efficiently cut loose the second they stop being useful? Because I don't think Trump's silence is confusion or distraction or him simply not having heard about it yet. I think it's a decision, and decisions like that tend to be more revealing than anything said out loud. Let's start with who Mike Lindell actually was before this week, because you cannot understand the size of this fall without understanding the height he fell from. This was not some fringe local figure. This was, for a period of several years, one of the most visible and most financially committed foot soldiers of the entire 2020 election fraud movement. He put up millions of his own money for what he called a cyber symposium, a multi-day event where he promised to present hard proof, actual data, that the election had been stolen through foreign interference. He offered $5 million publicly to anyone who could prove the data wrong. Someone did. He didn't pay. The data itself turned out, on inspection, to be something closer to random spreadsheet noise dressed up as evidence, which is its own kind of poetry if you think about it. A man who built pillows for a living, selling the country a stuffing-free claim and calling it proof. He lost major retail partnerships over this. Big box stores that used to carry MyPillow quietly, then not so quietly, dropped the product. He got sued by Dominion Voting Systems for defamation and lost, and the judgments against him are not small, and they are not the kind of thing that goes away because you stop talking about them on television. He spent, by his own admission, repeatedly, on right-wing media, enormous sums of his personal fortune, keeping the 2020 fraud narrative alive well past the point where most of the people who started that movement alongside him had quietly moved on, hired defense lawyers just in case, or started angling for a more moderate second act. Lindell didn't do any of that hedging. He was, and I want to be precise about this because I think it's actually the most important fact in this entire story, the single most consistent, most financially committed, most publicly humiliated, and still didn't stop true believer in Trump's entire orbit. Everyone else calculated. Lindell just kept paying. And so, when he decided to run for governor of Minnesota, a blue state, in a cycle where a well-known Democratic incumbent senator is heavily favored statewide, you have to ask what the actual logic was there. And I think the honest answer is that The logic wasn't really electoral, it was personal. It was, in some sense, an attempt to convert years of loyalty and financial sacrifice into the one thing that loyalty is supposed to eventually buy you in that world: standing, a title, a seat at the table that isn't just guy who talks about pillows and election fraud on cable news, but the governor of Minnesota. And Trump gave him the one thing that, in theory, should have made that possible. He gave him the endorsement. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because Trump's endorsements are not small things inside the Republican Party right now. They function almost like a currency unto themselves. This idea that if Trump says your name with approval, a certain percentage of the base simply falls in line, no further questions asked. And to a degree, that's exactly what happened here. Lindell didn't win the primary, but he didn't finish last either. He finished second, which, if you think about it for more than a few seconds, is actually the more unsettling data point in this whole story, because it means there is a real, measurable block of Republican primary voters who will support essentially anyone Trump tells them to, regardless of that candidate's actual record, actual credibility, or actual chance of winning in November. That's not a Lindell story. That's a structural story about how the party currently allocates power, and it's worth sitting with for a second before we move on, because it's going to matter again later. But the endorsement, it turns out, only goes so far. It gets you votes. It does not get you competence. It does not get you a functioning campaign infrastructure. And it certainly does not get you immunity from the fact that Minnesota Republicans, when they actually looked at the field, decided they wanted someone with an actual path to competing statewide in November, rather than someone whose national brand is now inseparable from the guy who lost the Dominion lawsuit. So he lost. And the moment the Associated Press called the race, and I want you to actually sit with the phrase "the moment," because we're not talking about days, we're talking about essentially real time. Trump's engagement with Mike Lindell simply stopped. No rally appearance, no rigged election claim on his behalf, no defense of the process, nothing. The most loyal man in the entire movement lost an election, and the person he was most loyal to had, by all observable evidence, already moved on to the next news cycle before Lindell had even finished processing what happened to him. And that's the part I think is genuinely worth understanding, because it's not really about Trump being cold or ungrateful or whatever adjective feels satisfying in the moment. It's about something more mechanical than that. Trump's political brand has always run on a very specific fuel, which is offense. Not offense as in being offended, offense as in the opposite of defense, the constant forward motion, the sense of momentum, of winning, of the other guy always being the one who's losing. Defending a loser, publicly at length, costs him something in that currency. It doesn't add to the winning narrative. It subtracts from it. So the silence isn't confusion, it's arithmetic. Lindell became, the instant the votes were counted, a bad investment. And Trump's entire political method for 2 decades has been an almost instinctive refusal to hold on to bad investments a moment longer than necessary. Which, if you're on the outside looking in, is a genuinely useful thing to know about how that entire ecosystem works. Loyalty flows up. It does not reliably flow back down. And I suspect there are a lot of people in Trump's orbit right now, not just Lindell, quietly doing the math on what that means for them. Now let's talk about what Lindell is actually doing instead of conceding, because this is where it stops being sad and starts being, honestly, kind of instructive about how this entire genre of claim actually works when you look at it closely. He said there are irregularities. His people say some group, it's never entirely clear which group or how many people are on it, found anomalies late in the vote counting process. He's pointed to a poll, one poll, taken 3 days before the election, that had him ahead by 9 points, and used the gap between that poll and the actual result as evidence that something must have gone wrong. Now, of course, the much more boring explanation, the one that doesn't require any conspiracy at all, is that the poll was simply wrong, which, if you've paid any attention to statewide primary polling over the last several cycles, happens constantly, and not because of some hidden hand manipulating outcomes, but because polling people who might show up to a low turnout primary is genuinely one of the hardest things to do in political science. We've seen exactly this kind of polling miss in multiple recent Midwestern primaries on both sides of the aisle, for entirely mundane reasons having to do with turnout modeling and sample size. But the poll was wrong doesn't give you anywhere to go. There were anomalies does. Here's the number that actually matters, though, and I think it gets buried under all the vaguer language about irregularities and deviations. Lindell lost by roughly 11 percentage points. That's somewhere in the neighborhood of 45,000 votes. Minnesota's automatic recount threshold, the point at which the state itself steps in and rechecks the count because the margin is close enough to plausibly matter, is a quarter of 1 percentage point. 11 points is not close to a quarter of a point. It is not in the same conversation as a quarter of a point. You could find actual, real, documented anomalies, a miscounted precinct here, a transposed digit there, the kind of small human error that exists in literally every election ever run by human beings, and it would not move the outcome by anything close to enough to matter, because 45,000 votes is not the kind of gap that gets closed by one person on one team said they saw something. It's the kind of gap that gets closed by evidence, specific, documented, precinct-level, machine-level evidence. And as of this recording, nobody, not Lindell, not his campaign, not the vague teams he keeps referencing, has produced a single specific instance. Not one machine, not one precinct, not one ballot batch. Just the feeling that it should have gone differently, dressed up in the language of investigation. And look, I understand the instinct here. I actually do, because losing is genuinely hard, and losing publicly. After you've spent your entire public identity for half a decade insisting that elections can be stolen through invisible mechanisms only you and your teams can detect, creates a very specific kind of trap. Because to concede this race cleanly, to just say, I lost, congratulations to my opponent, on to November, would require Lindell to implicitly admit something much bigger than losing a primary. It would require him to admit that the entire architecture of his public life since 2020, the cyber symposium, the $5 million, the Dominion lawsuit, the retail boycotts he weathered, all of it, might have been built on a claim that simply wasn't true. That's a much harder thing to concede than a governor's race. So instead, the pattern repeats, because the pattern is, at this point, the only tool he has left. It's not really a strategy. It's closer to a reflex. Now, why does any of this matter beyond Mike Lindell himself, beyond one man's very personal reckoning with a bad month? Because I think this moment is actually a pretty clean case study in something much bigger that's happening across the American right, and it's worth pulling the lens back for a second before we close this out. There are, right now, a meaningful number of Republican candidates and officials who have built some version of the Lindell playbook into their own political identity. Not necessarily the specific 2020 claims, but the underlying mechanism, which is when you lose, you don't concede, you investigate, you gesture at anomalies, you let the ambiguity do the work that evidence can't. And what this episode shows, with unusual clarity, is what happens to that playbook the moment it's actually stress-tested against a clean, unambiguous, double-digit loss with a sitting president's endorsement already spent and nothing left to gain from defending it. The playbook doesn't hold, the math doesn't care how loyal you were, and the political infrastructure that used to amplify these claims, Trump's own voice, chief among them, evaporates precisely at the moment it would actually cost something to keep using it. That's the real consequence here, I think, for the country more broadly, not just for Lindell's finances, which, by the way, are genuinely in serious trouble. The defamation judgments don't pause because you're having a hard month, and courts have shown no particular interest in accepting a true social post as a form of payment. The broader consequence is what this teaches every other candidate currently sitting on an unproven fraud claim, watching this play out. It teaches them that the movement's support for these claims was never really about the claims. It was about utility. It was about whether defending you in that particular moment made Trump look like a winner or made him look like he was wasting his breath on a lost cause. The instant Lindell stopped being useful, the apparatus that spent years validating exactly this kind of claim simply declined to show up for the one making it. And if you're a Republican official anywhere in the country currently weighing whether to contest a close loss this way, that is, I would think, an extremely uncomfortable thing to have just watched happen to the single most loyal person in the entire ecosystem. So, where does this actually go from here? Honestly, probably nowhere dramatic, which is itself the point. Lindell will likely keep investigating for a while longer, because stopping requires an admission he isn't ready to make. The Republican Party in Minnesota will move on with its actual nominee, because November is close and Amy Klobuchar is not waiting around. Trump will stay quiet, because staying quiet costs him nothing, and defending Lindell would cost him something, and he has never once in his political career chosen the option that costs him something, when the free option was sitting right there. And Mike Lindell, the most financially devoted, most publicly humiliated, longest-suffering true believer in the entire Trump movement, will keep checking a phone that, by every available piece of evidence, is simply not going to ring. There is something almost too neat about that, honestly. The man who spent 5 years insisting that the system quietly works against people without their knowledge has now become, in the most literal and personal sense imaginable, a case study in exactly that. He just picked the wrong system to worry about. I'm Marcus Fenn. This is Borderlines. This channel is just getting started, and if you think this kind of analysis is worth having, subscribe now and be here from the beginning, because the most important stories, as it turns out, tend to start with somebody checking a phone that isn't ringing.